There's a man who may have changed the course of human history more than almost anyone else, and yet we cannot be certain he ever truly existed. His idea was so powerful that it still shapes the science of our own age, but the person behind it has nearly dissolved into the mist of time, leaving us with one of the strangest mysteries in all of philosophy. Somewhere in the Greek world, around 2,500 years ago, a thinker named Leucippus looked at the solid world around him and asked a question that would echo forever. What would happen, he wondered, if you took any object and cut it in half, and then cut that half in half, and kept cutting again and again without ever stopping? Could you go on dividing a piece of matter forever into smaller and smaller fragments with no end? Or would you eventually reach something so tiny that it simply could not be cut any further? In that single, almost childlike question lay the seed of one of the most important ideas humanity has ever conceived. No one around him could have guessed that a question so simple would one day split the world into a new age of science. Almost everything about the life of Leucippus is lost, wrapped in a fog so thick that scholars still argue about the most basic facts. We are not even sure where he was born, with ancient sources naming several different cities, from Miletus to Abdera to Elea. We do not know the year of his birth, the shape of his face, the sound of his voice, or a single detail of his daily life. He is less a fully drawn portrait than a faint outline, a shadow glimpsed at the very dawn of scientific thought. And yet this shadowy figure may have lit one of the brightest flames in the entire history of ideas. And so we are left to reconstruct a giant of thought from little more than scattered whispers and second-hand reports. Piecing him together is like sketching a face from a single faded footprint left in the sand. So little is known about him that some ancient thinkers went to an astonishing extreme in their doubt. Certain philosophers, including followers of a rival school, actually claimed that Leucippus had never existed at all. They suggested he was merely a name, a phantom, perhaps invented to lend authority to ideas that others had truly created. Imagine the strangeness of that fate, to have your very existence denied by the people who came after you. It is as if history itself could not decide whether this man was a living genius or only a beautiful rumor whispered across the centuries. Yet even a phantom, if that is what he was, cast a shadow long enough to reach into our own century, and still the idea that outlived him refuses to let his name disappear completely. Most scholars today, however, believe that Leucippus was very real, and that he was a thinker of genuine and startling brilliance. The confusion likely arose because his ideas became so completely tangled with those of his famous student that the two men blurred into one. His theories were absorbed, expanded, and made famous by another, until the master vanished behind the pupil like a candle outshone by a rising sun. This is one of the quiet tragedies of intellectual history, that the one who first strikes the spark is often forgotten while another carries the torch to glory. Leucippus, it seems, was destined to be remembered mostly for being forgotten. History, it turns out, can be careless with its greatest gifts, letting the giver slip quietly out of sight. To understand why his idea mattered so much, we must first picture the world of thought he was born into. The philosophers before him were locked in a fierce and seemingly hopeless battle over the deepest nature of reality itself. On one side stood thinkers who insisted that all was change and flux, that nothing ever stayed the same for a single instant. On the other stood a formidable school, led by a man named Parmenides, who argued with airtight logic that change was impossible, and that reality was one solid, motionless, unchanging whole. Into this great deadlock, Leucippus would step with an idea that shattered the impasse forever. The stage was set, in other words, for a mind bold enough to break a chain that had bound philosophy for a generation. Parmenides had posed a challenge that was truly terrifying in its logical power. He had argued that for anything to move or change, there would have to be empty space, a void, a region of pure nothingness for things to move into. But nothingness, he insisted, cannot exist, for the very notion of non-being is a contradiction, and so the void was impossible. And if there is no empty space anywhere, then nothing can ever move, and all motion and change must be a grand illusion cast upon our senses. This was the wall of reason that every thinker of the age crashed against, unable to climb over it. No thinker of the day had found a way past this crushing argument, and so the whole of philosophy stood frozen. It was less a wall than a prison, and the whole of philosophy sat locked inside it. What Leucippus did next was an act of breathtaking intellectual daring that would ripple across the ages. Rather than accepting that motion was impossible, he made one bold and revolutionary move. He simply declared that the void does exist. Empty space, he insisted, is real, a genuine nothingness through which things can travel and rearrange themselves. In one stroke, he denied the very premise that had trapped philosophy in paralysis, and in doing so, he flung open a door that had seemed forever sealed. It took a rare kind of courage to look at the greatest logician of the age and calmly answer that he was wrong. With that one word, yes, the void is real, he set the trapped machinery of the cosmos back into motion. From this single bold assumption, an entire vision of reality began to unfold with stunning logic. If empty space is real, Leucippus reasoned, then matter must be able to move through it and break apart within it. But the cutting cannot go on forever, for if it did, everything would eventually crumble into nothing at all. There must therefore be tiny, solid pieces of matter that can never be cut or divided any further, the ultimate building blocks of everything that exists. These indivisible particles were the foundation of his whole daring new picture of the universe. Piece by piece, from a single premise, he was assembling a picture of reality that no one had ever drawn before. Each step followed the last with an almost unstoppable force, like a proof unfolding in the dark. A single Greek word for these uncuttable particles has come down to us as one of the most famous terms in all of science. He called them atoma, which means simply that which cannot be cut, the indivisible. These atoms, in his vision, were infinitely small, eternal, and utterly solid, with no empty space inside them at all. They had always existed and could never be created or destroyed, tumbling endlessly through the boundless void. In naming them, Leucippus gave humanity a word and a concept that would sleep for 2,000 years before awakening to transform the modern world. It was a name destined to travel further through time than the man who first spoke it ever could. We still speak it today, every time we name the building blocks of the physical world. Picture the universe as Leucippus imagined it, and you will glimpse something astonishingly close to a modern vision. Reality, he taught, consists of just two things: atoms and the empty space in which they move. Everything you have ever seen or touched or loved, every mountain and ocean and living creature, is nothing more than countless tiny atoms arranged in different patterns. There is no other substance, no mysterious essence, only these hard little particles drifting and colliding in the infinite void. It is a picture of stark and beautiful simplicity, and it lies at the very foundation of the science we trust today. Strip away the myths and the mysteries, he seemed to say, and what remains is simply this: particles and space. How then does the rich and varied world we see arise from nothing but atoms and emptiness? Leucippus answered that the atoms differ from one another in their shapes and sizes, some round, some jagged, some hooked like tiny anchors. As they hurtle through the void, they collide, bounce, and sometimes catch on to one another, locking together into larger and larger structures. A thing feels solid to us because its atoms are packed tightly, and soft because they are loosely joined. All the endless variety of the world in his vision springs from the different arrangements of these tiny, tumbling pieces. The world, in his eyes, was a vast dance of shapes, forever locking together and breaking apart.
Nothing was added and nothing was lost, only endlessly rearranged into new and passing forms. One of the most profound aspects of his thinking was his insistence that nothing happens by pure chance. Leucippus is credited with a powerful saying that nothing occurs at random, but everything happens for a reason and by necessity. In his universe, every collision of atoms follows from the collisions before it, in an unbroken chain of cause and effect. There are no gods reaching down to move the pieces, no mysterious purposes guiding events, only the relentless mechanics of matter in motion. This was one of the earliest and boldest visions of a universe governed entirely by natural law rather than divine whim. With this idea, he placed the whole universe under the rule of cause and effect long before science was born.
Consider just how revolutionary this vision truly was in an age steeped in myth and superstition. All around him, people explained the world through the moods of gods, through omens, prayers, and sacred stories passed down for generations. Leucippus swept all of this aside and proposed that the entire cosmos could be understood as matter moving through space according to fixed and knowable laws. He was, in a very real sense, one of the first people to imagine a mechanical universe, a vast machine running on its own, without any need for supernatural hands. This was a staggering leap of the human imagination. To think this way, in his time, was almost to stand alone against the beliefs of an entire civilization. He was, in his quiet way, one of the first rebels against a universe ruled by the gods. Imagining that the world is built from invisible particles required an almost superhuman act of pure reason. No one in the ancient world could see an atom, could weigh one, or could prove its existence with any instrument. Leucippus arrived at his atoms not through observation, but through the sheer force of logical argument, reasoning his way toward a truth that lay utterly beyond the reach of the senses. He was performing a kind of thought experiment of the highest order, following where cold logic led, even when it pointed toward the invisible. In this, he showed the extraordinary power of the human mind to grasp what the eye can never see. He trusted the argument itself, even when it led him toward things no human eye would ever behold. Around him, or perhaps drawn to him, gathered a young and hungry mind who would carry his ideas to immortality. This was Democritus, a brilliant and tireless thinker who became the student, colleague, or follower of Leucippus. Together, or in succession, these two men built the philosophy we now call atomism, one of the most influential systems of thought in human history. Democritus wrote prolifically, elaborating and defending the atomic theory in dozens of works, spreading it far and wide across the Greek world. And in doing so, he unwittingly cast his teacher into the deep shadow from which he has never fully emerged. And so the pupil's brilliance became, in a cruel twist, the very thing that hid the master from view. Few relationships in ancient philosophy are as tangled and puzzling as the bond between these two thinkers. So closely were their ideas woven together that even the ancients could not always tell where the master's work ended and the student's began. Some sources credit the great foundational insights to Leucippus, while the vast elaboration belongs to Democritus. It is a little like trying to separate the first spark from the roaring fire it kindled, for the two seem forever bound together. Yet most who study the question carefully conclude that the original, revolutionary idea belonged to the older man. What is clear is that between them they lit a fire that would smolder for 2,000 years before blazing again.
It is worth pausing to feel the strange injustice at the heart of this story. Democritus became famous throughout the ancient world, celebrated as the laughing philosopher, and quoted by thinkers for centuries afterward. Leucippus, meanwhile, faded into near oblivion, his very existence questioned, his name a mere footnote beside his dazzling pupil. And yet, if the ancient testimony is to be trusted, it was Leucippus who first dared to imagine the atom and the void. There is something quietly heartbreaking in the fate of a man who gives the world a priceless gift and receives so little remembrance in return. The spark is so easily forgotten once the flame it started begins to light the whole world. And yet the spark, not the flame, is where the true miracle of creation always begins. Astonishingly ahead of its time, the atomic theory these men created was far more than merely clever. They proposed that the soul itself was made of atoms, fine and smooth ones that gave living things their motion and awareness. They suggested that our sensations arise as atoms stream off objects and strike our senses, a bold attempt to explain perception through pure physical mechanics. They even imagined countless other worlds forming and dissolving throughout the infinite void, some with suns and moons, some without. These were ideas of dizzying scope, reaching far beyond anything their contemporaries dared to think. Reaching for the soul, the senses, and even other worlds, their curiosity seemed to know no boundary at all. Their vision of infinite worlds is particularly haunting when we consider it from our modern vantage point. Leucippus and his school taught that the atoms, tumbling eternally through boundless space, would naturally form not just one world, but an endless number of them. Some of these worlds would be like our own, others utterly different. Some being born even as others were dying away. 24 centuries before astronomers began to speak of countless planets and distant galaxies, these ancient thinkers had already imagined a universe teeming with other worlds. It is a breathtaking example of how far reason alone can leap ahead of its age. To dream of other worlds in an age that barely understood its own was an act of almost reckless imagination. Not everyone welcomed this bold new philosophy, and some of the greatest minds of Greece rose up against it. Both Plato and Aristotle, the towering giants of ancient thought, rejected the atomic theory and argued fiercely against it. Plato is even said to have disliked Democritus so intensely that he wished all his books could be burned. Their immense authority helped push atomism to the margins of respectable thought for many centuries, a philosophy kept alive only by a devoted few. The idea that might have accelerated science by 2,000 years was quietly set aside by the very greatest thinkers of the age, and so a truth that might have transformed the world was quietly buried beneath the weight of greater fame.
For all its brilliance, the theory did pass down through a handful of loyal followers who refused to let it die. A philosopher named Epicurus took up atomism and made it the foundation of his own famous school, teaching that understanding the physical world could free people from fear. Through Epicurus, the atomic idea survived and spread, carried forward by those who found in it a path to peace of mind. Centuries later, a Roman poet named Lucretius wrote a magnificent poem laying out the whole atomic vision in soaring verse. That single poem, nearly lost, would one day help reignite the scientific imagination of the world. Through these devoted few, a fragile thread of genius was passed hand to hand across the darkening centuries. How this idea survived across the ages reads like a thriller, full of near disasters and lucky escapes. As the ancient world crumbled and knowledge was lost, the atomic theory teetered on the very edge of vanishing forever. The great poem of Lucretius, which preserved so much of the vision, survived through only a tiny handful of fragile copies gathering dust in forgotten libraries. Had those few manuscripts perished, as so many did, the entire atomic tradition might have been erased from human memory. The thread connecting Leucippus to the modern world was, at times, terrifyingly thin. Everything, at more than one moment, hung upon the survival of a few crumbling pages no one was reading. A single fire, a single flood, a single careless hand could have ended the story forever. Then, more than 1,000 years later, came a moment of rediscovery that would change everything. In the Renaissance, scholars hunting for lost ancient texts uncovered the long-forgotten poem of Lucretius, and its ideas exploded back into the world. Thinkers read with astonishment this ancient vision of a universe made of tiny particles moving through empty space. The atomic idea, planted so long ago by a nearly forgotten Greek, began to stir once more in the minds of a new age of curiosity.
What Leucippus had imagined in isolation was about to become the foundation of modern science. What had been a whisper in the ruins suddenly became a roar in the minds of a reawakening world. Suddenly, a dead man's dream was alive again, whispering into the ears of a new age. Those who built the modern world drew directly from this ancient wellspring, often without knowing its deepest source. When thinkers began to explain chemistry, physics, and the behavior of matter, they returned again and again to the idea of tiny, indivisible particles. The concept of the atom, born in the mind of an ancient Greek, became the cornerstone of the entire scientific revolution. For centuries, the word atom carried within it the exact meaning Leucippus had given it, the thing that cannot be cut. His ghostly fingerprint lay upon the very foundation of the world that science was building. Without always realizing it, they were completing a project begun by a man dead for more than 2,000 years. The ancient ghost, it seems, had been waiting patiently for the world to catch up with him.
There is a beautiful irony in what happened next, one that Leucippus himself could never have foreseen. In the early 20th century, scientists discovered that the atom could, in fact, be split apart into even smaller pieces. The very thing he had defined as uncuttable turned out to be divisible after all, made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Yet this discovery did not diminish his achievement in the slightest, for his deeper insight remained triumphantly correct. He had grasped the profound truth that matter is not continuous, but is built from discrete, fundamental building blocks, and in that he was gloriously right. What he had truly seen was not the uncuttable atom itself, but the deeper law that matter comes in pieces. Reflect for a moment on the sheer audacity of what this shadowy figure accomplished with nothing but his mind. He had no laboratories, no microscopes, no experiments, no colleagues checking his work across the globe. He had only the power of human reasoning and the courage to follow it into the invisible depths of matter. From this alone, he reached a conclusion so fundamental that it would anchor the science of civilizations he could never have imagined. Few acts of pure thought in all history have proven so deep, so daring, and so astonishingly close to the truth. To reach so far with reason alone remains one of the most astonishing feats the human mind has ever performed. With only his mind for an instrument, he touched a truth that laboratories would confirm ages later. When we ponder the mystery of his near erasure from history, it stirs something deep within us. Here was a person who may have handed humanity one of its most powerful ideas, only to be repaid with doubt, obscurity, and even the denial of his own existence. It reminds us how fragile fame truly is, how easily the names of the greatest can slip through the cracks of memory. The world remembers its conquerors and kings, yet it so often forgets the quiet thinkers who reshaped how we understand reality itself. Leucippus stands as a haunting symbol of all the forgotten pioneers of the human mind. We honor the loud and the mighty, and let the quiet architects of our understanding fade into silence. His fate is a quiet warning about how easily greatness can vanish from the memory of the world. Yet perhaps there is a strange kind of immortality in his very anonymity, deeper than ordinary fame. Every schoolchild who learns about atoms, every scientist who splits them, every person who marvels at the particles that make up their own body is touching the idea he first imagined. His name may be a whisper, but his thought is woven into the fabric of how we understand everything. In this sense, Leucippus has achieved something greater than being remembered, for he has become a permanent part of the way the human race sees the world. His face is gone, his voice is gone, his story is nearly gone, and still his idea lives inside every one of us. To be forgotten as a person, yet immortal as an idea, is a stranger fate than fame itself.
Looking back across the vast gulf of centuries, we can begin to grasp the true magnitude of his contribution. He helped break the paralysis that had gripped Greek philosophy, offering a way for motion and change to be real once more. He proposed a universe governed by natural law rather than the caprice of gods,
a foundational step toward all of science. And above all, he gave us the atom, the single most important concept in our understanding of the physical world. From a life we can barely glimpse, there emerged an idea that would help remake civilization itself. From almost nothing, from a life we can scarcely prove, came a thought that helped remake the whole world. Few human beings have ever given so much to the future while asking so little from it. The story of Leucippus, in the end, leaves us with a question as haunting as the man himself. How many other forgotten geniuses lie buried in the silence of history, their gifts absorbed by others, their names lost to the centuries? Every time we split an atom, power a city, or gaze into the heart of matter, we are living inside the dream of a man we barely know existed. His life may be a mystery, his face forever unseen, his very reality once denied, and yet his idea burns brighter now than ever before. In the end, the ghost philosopher gave the world something far more lasting than a face or a name, and that, perhaps, is the most fitting monument of all, for a man who taught us that the smallest things matter most.
Leucippus lived and died in a fog of mystery so complete that we cannot say for certain where he was born, what he looked like, or even, according to some ancient voices, whether he existed at all. And yet the idea he dared to imagine has outlasted empires, religions, and entire civilizations. He was the thinker who refused to accept that motion was impossible, who declared that empty space is real, and who reasoned his way to the astonishing conclusion that all of reality is made of tiny, uncuttable particles endlessly dancing through the void. His student Democritus carried the theory to fame. Epicurus and Lucretius kept it alive through the long darkness, and the scientists of the modern age resurrected it to build the very foundation of physics and chemistry. That the atom could later be split does nothing to diminish him, for his deepest insight that matter is made of discrete, fundamental pieces remains one of the truest things any human being has ever grasped. If his strange and shadowed story has stirred something in you, let it be a reminder that ideas can be immortal even when the people who birthed them are forgotten, that the quiet power of a single reasoning mind can reshape the destiny of the entire species, and that somewhere behind the great achievements we take for granted stand lonely, half-remembered dreamers who saw the truth before anyone else. So the next time you hear the word atom, spare a thought for the ghost who first imagined it, and marvel that a man we can scarcely prove was real gave humanity a truth that will never die.